Beginning in December of 1941, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, roughly 10 days after America declares war on Japan, Congress decides to pass what's called the War Powers Act. And this is the government's effort to look at all of the different resources that it has and try to assess what it needs to add to the mix. Okay. There are several government agencies that already are in existence that have been used since World War I, and in some cases, the need is going to end up outweighing what America already has in its arsenal. So we have to end up revamping a few things, creating a few new government agencies in the process. And of course, we end up doing the exact same thing that happened in the First World War, and that the government ends up regulating all business and all industry in the exact same way that it did before. It takes over the automotive industries, it takes over several factories, and begins converting them into factories for planes, for tanks, bombs, bullets, guns, you name it. And we also have another brief little revamping of the whole idea of censoring the mail, right? Trying to make sure that no spies get hold of any information, especially since we're building the atomic bomb now. So there's a lot at stake here, and so the government has to kind of do a lot of oversight during this period, just like it did in the First World War. It's estimated that somewhere around 16 million men end up serving in the war, and several 100,000 women get involved this time as well. Okay, they're not just stuck at home working in the factories, taking over jobs that men used to have. Now they're having a more active role in the military itself. And statistically speaking, the average soldier is roughly 26 years old, is about 5'8", and weighs about 144 pounds. Okay, so this is usually a scrawny little guy by comparison. Typically is someone who might come from a malnourished background, and understandably so, because the government and the country has been in the midst of a Great Depression for the last 10 or 15 years. It's estimated that 1 in 10 soldiers end up attending college at some point in their life, and only about 1 in 4 are high school graduates. In 1942, Franklin Roosevelt creates what's called the War Production Board. And this is what ends up converting all of the civilian manufacturing into military manufacturing. Okay, so beginning in 1941, it's estimated that there are about 3 million automobiles that are created in the United States, and within the next 4 years, only 139 are made. Okay, just because of how much of a major overhaul actually happens in this type of manufacturing. It's estimated that about 300,000 warplanes, 89,000 tanks, 3 million machine guns, and 7 million rifles are all produced by American manufacturers by the end of the war. Okay, so this is no small task, and it's kind of miraculous that America manages to pull all this out of its hat. Revenue Act of 1942 does exactly what you would expect to happen during wartime. Okay, it ends up increasing taxes a little bit to end up financing the war, and this is quite a bit of money. I mean, compared to what World War I cost America versus what World War II cost us, $33 billion in 1918 is what the war ended up costing for World War I. For World War II, estimated, adjusted for inflation and everything, it's about $3 trillion in today's terms. So this is a lot of money, right? Ends up dramatically outpacing what we had before. And 45% of the war ends up being funded by taxes. Okay, and so again, we have to kind of bridge that gap, and we primarily do it through the war bond campaign. Okay, so you have people who are trying to sell stock in the government. People want to invest in the government. We win the war. Country does well. People get a paycheck in a few years. Okay, so it's a long-term investment. And it's estimated that the national debt is about 6 times higher at the end of the war than it was before. And as you can imagine, I mean, this is the precipitating event that ends the Great Depression, but it ends up, costing us more in the long term. And over a dozen new federal agencies get created in the process. Okay, civilian federal workers end up going up to 4 times what they were for the end of the war. And unemployment goes down from 14% in 1940 down to only 2% in 1943. So, as I said, this is pretty effective in terms of ending the Great Depression. And 24 million Americans end up migrating to the West Coast as well, most of them being farmers who live in the Midwest, in certain parts of the South that are affected by the Dust Bowl. And so, again, it ends up changing the demographics of the country once again. Office of Price Administration is created in 1942, and so we have another situation just like the First World War, okay, just like we had with the Food Administration with, Herbert Hoover, I believe, right, ended up setting price ceilings, making sure no one is price gouging anything. And so we start seeing little advertisements for people to start rationing food. There's ration coupons that are given to everybody in the country, stuff for sugar, for coffee, for gasoline, things that are typically sent overseas to troops, as well as stuff that can be used here at home. And by the time the midterm elections come around in 1942, the Republicans end up actually gaining 46 House seats and 9 in the Senate. Okay, so it sounds like FDR is beginning to work with a little bit of opposition here. And unfortunately, with this new surge in conservatism in Congress, we see a lot of the New Deal programs, the Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and so forth, National Youth Association, all these different programs end up going the way of the dinosaur, essentially. Conservatives say that this is the federal government getting too big for itself, right? It's something we don't need, right? We're doing better now as a country, so for better or for worse, these programs end up going away. And there's also security measures that are put in place just in case any kind of organized labor problems end up surfacing. Okay, something called the Smith-Connolly War Labor Disputes Act is passed to make sure that plants and mines are kept in operation just in case a strike happens. Okay, so we still have a few instances where organized labor doesn't always meet eye to eye with upper management, so sometimes strikes do occur. And women's roles are changing dramatically once again, right? We already saw that women were entering into similar positions that men occupied in the First World War. Okay, they ended up working in factories, working manual labor jobs and so forth. But now, again, women are taking a much more active role in the military itself. Okay? For one thing, in the civilian sector, over 8 million women enter the workforce. Okay, and before in the First World War, we had about 4 million positions that were left vacant, and about 3 million of them got filled in the process. So this is double and almost triple what we saw in the First World War. And women are serving more and more in what's called the WWII, right, the Women's Army Corps, right? So about 350,000 women are serving in that. Women accepted for volunteer emergency services, WAVES, right? This is kind of the naval version of that. And the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, and the new Army Air Force all have women who are volunteering as well. So they may be serving as Army or military nurses. They may be serving in clerical positions and so forth. In some cases, they even serve as spies. Okay, so there's all kinds of different new ways that women are utilized in these areas. And the country actually does very briefly create a national daycare program, right? Something where child care is actually provided for women who are actually going to work full time. It's estimated that about 1 million African Americans end up serving in the war as well. And again, in most cases, this is still before the U.S. Armed Forces are desegregated. Okay, so there are still black units, there are still white units, and most of the time, black soldiers are only given menial tasks. Okay, they may be digging latrines, they may be digging trenches or something like that. They may be constructing, buildings. They may be moving mobile army surgical hospitals or something along those lines. So again, they're typically given construction tasks before actually seeing combat over time. Okay, and even the American Armed Forces in general doesn't really get involved in direct face-to-face combat on the ground until 1944, about a year before the war ends. And of course, we still have the Great Migration going on in a new wave. Okay, 500,000 African Americans end up leaving the South again during wartime to move into the North. Kind of a repeat again from what we saw in the First World War. Okay, a lot of the same trends. Okay, moving north to get away from the Jim Crow laws, to make sure that they can get work in a northern factory, escape segregation, discrimination as much as they can. And about 1 million of them actually end up leaving the agricultural sector altogether and joining the industrial workforce. So they may have worked on a farm for most of their life until the war hits. Then they might be able to find a better job in a factory. And a lot of southern textile mills are beginning to employ people as well. It's estimated that actually most of the army bases in the United States and most of the textile mills that create uniforms for soldiers are actually located in the South. Okay, so this is actually becoming a more higher need area, okay, an area where there's a lot more jobs to be had. So about 60% of all army camps are actually located in the South during the war. And surprisingly enough, the U.S. rural population actually ends up decreasing by about 20%. Okay, and a large part of that is due to the northern migration of African Americans. And one particularly notable group that you may have heard of before, if not, you'll certainly hear of them again, is called the Tuskegee Airmen. Okay, these are a contingency of 600 black pilots that are actually trained in Tuskegee, Alabama, near the Tuskegee Institute. Right, this is where they're actually trained to fly fighter jets. And again, because they're a segregated group, right, they have to kind of do this, under their own auspices, right, kind of going along the lines of what W.E.B. Du Bois was advocating for at the end of the 19th century, right? Something to rival what whites are doing at the same time. And the Tuskegee Airmen end up flying 15,000 missions during the midst of the Second World War. Okay, so this is something that is, dramatically important in the midst of all this. And ultimately, the Tuskegee Airmen are directly responsible for the desegregation of the armed forces because they have to prove themselves in order to get the country to actually take notice of what they're doing. When it comes to other minorities, now it's not just a question of African Americans and whites in the United States. Now it becomes much more diverse. Okay. For instance, in 1942, we have something called the Bracero program that's created. And this specifically deals with Mexican Americans entering the United States. Okay. Mexico makes a deal with the U.S. To provide several seasonal farm workers to come in on a year-long contract to the United States, and they are provided working and living conditions in that time. Okay, so it's kind of like an itinerant farm worker program. Right, they're given sponsorship on a specific farm. They're given room and board in exchange for a year's worth of work. Okay, so it's something that's actually constantly renewed all the way through, I believe, the 1950s and even into the 60s in some cases. And about 200,000 Mexican farm workers ended up coming to the U.S. through the program. Okay, and there are still about as many who enter into the U.S. In an undocumented status. Okay, so this is still a period where illegal immigration is still an issue. It becomes more and more of an issue over time. As the U.S. is dealing with the war, it's not really devoting a lot of time and effort into catching anybody who's trying to come in undocumented. And about 300,000 Mexicans actually do end up serving in the war, not necessarily even as American citizens, but just Mexico in general. And it's estimated nearly 1/3 of all Native American men end up serving in the war. Okay, this is another contingency that doesn't get a whole lot of attention during all this. For one thing, several of the New Deal programs end up actually going away in the midst of the war, and the ones that do go away actually end up benefiting Native Americans. Okay, so a lot of Native Americans end up unemployed in the process. A lot of them are already living in poverty. They have been for several generations by this point. So for some of them, the only alternative is to join the military. And they are actually integrated into white units, although they do face a lot of prejudice and mistreatment and so forth. And the Navajo Code Talkers is probably the most well-known contingency of Native Americans who serve in the war. Every military branch ends up using these guys to actually come in, because the Navajo language is something that most of the Europeans and the Axis powers in particular are not familiar with, right? It's not something that's widely translated. And so when the code talkers come in, anytime they are sending any kind of a radio transmission, they get someone to come on and speak it in Navajo. Okay, and so you have, a Navajo tribesman in the United States, perhaps speaking to a tribesman stationed somewhere in Europe or in the Philippines or somewhere like that, and that way the Axis powers don't know the language, they can't translate it, and it makes it easier to mask movements and that sort of thing. Okay, so it's a pretty ingenious way of doing it, and it provides a lot more public worth in the eyes of America to Native Americans during the war. And Japanese Americans are the ones who are probably the most discriminated against in the course of the war, especially after the attack on Pearl Harbor. For one thing, in February of 1942, probably the most infamous thing that the government does is it executes what's called Order 9066. And what this is it's kind of this disaster scenario where the U.S. government comes in and orders over 120,000 what are called Nisei, people who are of Japanese descent, who are living in the United States, who are maybe a generation or two removed from their initial immigrant relatives. Okay, over 120,000 of them are rounded up and put into what are called, euphemistically anyway, war relocation camps in the United States. They're concentration camps, basically, is what it amounts to. There are a few here in Texas. There are some stretching from Texas all the way into the West Coast. Okay, California probably has the most, although there are some located in New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, that sort of thing. A couple in Utah, I believe, but they're kind of scattered here and there. And these people are essentially rounded up and put there, quote unquote, just in case, right? Just in case any of them are spies or are working on behalf of the Japanese Empire. People become extremely distrusting of Japanese Americans, and so just like what we saw a little bit in World War I, where German Americans were targeted, okay, the same type of thing ends up happening in World War II. And as a funny little side note, one of the individuals who's actually put onto one of these concentration camps as a child is actually taught how to animate and ends up creating the Scooby-Doo cartoon in the midst of all this. So all kinds of strange little happenstances end up occurring here, but this is just one little quip that you can take with you. And of course, the people who are removed from their homes, again, most of them are middle class people, rather, right? They have successful businesses. Many of them are doctors, are lawyers, are professionals, and they and their entire families are relocated to some of these camps, and they're forced to live in tents and sleep on cots in some cases. They're stripped of all civil rights. They're not allowed to speak to a lawyer or anything like that. Their property is even seized in some cases. And it takes the United States government until 1983 until they finally acknowledge the fact that they have committed a grave injustice here. Okay, and it's not until 5 years after that that $20,000 is granted to each living Nisei who experienced this. Okay, nearly, over 40 years after all this has occurred. So very few of them were still alive, right? The ones who were old enough to know what was going on, but even the government tries to make reparations, but in some cases too little too late. And it's estimated that 39,000 Japanese Americans actually end up serving in the war on the Allied side, right? Working for the United States government, fighting in the military, in some cases fighting against their own relatives in the Japanese Empire. Okay, so this is a pretty dramatic situation, right? Kind of like what we saw with World War I. Okay, people in some cases are fighting against their own ethnic and cultural identities, again, fighting against their own relatives in some cases. So there's an identity crisis that occurs in the midst of all this. Now, as the Holocaust comes around, this is a topic that cannot really be given the full appreciation here in this one particular setting that I'd like to give it. And I will probably end up posting a lot of information on, your discussion boards and so forth for those who are taking my class about this. There are entire courses out there, one in particular that I took as a graduate student that had to deal with the Holocaust over the course of 16 weeks. I mean, dealing with it in the next 5 or 10 minutes is virtually impossible to get the grand scope of everything. But in a nutshell, as much as I can give you, I will give. Okay. 2 years after Hitler comes to power, okay, he is made chancellor in 1933. He becomes the Führer in 1934. In 1935, Hitler enacts what are called the Nuremberg laws. Okay, and this is his first wave of discriminatory laws against Jews in Germany. Okay. He outlaws all marriages between ethnic Germans and Jews, okay, the people he insists are ethnic Germans, that is, right? People he believes are this mythical Aryan race, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed individuals who really, quite frankly, don't exist. And he starts trying to classify different ethnic peoples along these lines, right? Using the pseudosciences that we saw in the 19th century and in the early 20th century. Okay, the craniometry, physiognomy, looking at people's facial shapes, how far apart their eyes are, what color their eyes are, the shapes of their noses, is their hair curly or not, right? Things that can't really be quantified in any accurate way. And again, this is still at least a decade before DNA is really available for testing of any kind. Okay, so this is an impossible task that he's trying to use here. But what he does is anybody who is tested and deemed to be an ethnic German under these, inaccurate laws or whatever, is deemed a citizen. Okay, and all others who are, classified as Jews or Roma/Gypsies or whatever are called subjects. Okay, and subjects are denied all citizenship rights. Okay, so if you're an ethnic German, you are able to enjoy all citizenship rights, but if not, then tough. And so individuals like Jews, like the Romani, and African Americans, even though there are very few in Germany at this time, are all deemed quote-unquote enemies of the race-based state. Remember, this is one of Hitler's primary objectives as Führer, is to create a race-based state. Okay, he wants everybody in Germany to be ethnically monochromatic, right? And, just essentially everybody be the blonde-haired, blue-eyed individuals, right? He has this real propaganda-driven mindset of what he wants to happen here. One of the cruelest instances that occurs, and something that I don't think your textbook really covers in great detail, something that happens on the night of November 9th through the 10th in 1938, once the war is just beginning to ramp up, right? We're still about a year before it actually begins. In Germany, and it's an event known as Kristallnacht. Okay, in German, this simply means the night of broken glass. And it's called that because this is a scenario where Hitler sends the Gestapo and all of his supporters out into the streets of Germany overnight, and they end up vandalizing and destroying several Jewish-owned businesses. Several synagogues are burned. In fact, 267 synagogues all throughout Germany are burned. And several Jews are attacked physically on the street, right out in the open. Okay, they're beaten, they're intimidated, and it's called the Night of Broken Glass because several storefronts are smashed. Okay, a lot of Jews living in Germany might have worked as jewelers, as clockmakers, as artificers, right? Anybody who actually works with their hands, right? Any kind of a craftsman. Or even in the banking industry or something along those lines, but all these storefronts are vandalized, right? Or they've got signs that are pasted up that say Jews not wanted. So Kristallnacht is a brand new precedent that's been set, right? We haven't seen this kind of widespread destruction aimed toward one particular ethnic group anywhere in in Europe for quite a long time. Okay, this has happened a time or two before, several times, as a matter of fact, during the Middle Ages, but not during the 20th century, at least not yet. Okay, so this is a brand new precedent. And to add insult to injury, Hermann Göring, who you see here on the right-hand side, he's the head of the German Luftwaffe, the head of the Air Force. Okay, and he's one of Hitler's right-hand men here. He actually comes out and he fines the German Jewish community for the destruction. He hands them a bill for 1 billion German marks to pay up for the destruction that's been done to them. Okay, so he's not fining the German people who did these things. The government is not being fined. It's the people who are the victims who are being told to clean up the mess and to pay for it. Okay, so this is, and again, this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? A lot more horrible things are coming. And beginning at this point in time, too, this is where the German government begins saying that it is enforcing what it calls, quote-unquote, voluntary immigration. So it's basically giving Jews a brief window of time to get out of Germany. Okay, they're saying we don't want you here. This is what you have to look forward to, and of course, much worse, as we know, is yet to come. Okay, so this is kind of the beginning of when there is a larger Jewish diaspora that ends up occurring. Okay, the word diaspora just means a mass immigration of a group of people. Okay, so the Jewish diaspora ends up leaving Germany, leaving Central Europe, in some cases going all the way into Palestine before the state of Israel is actually created. This is when we start seeing what are called the Zionist movements begin. Okay, Zionism is this idea that Jews everywhere have an ancestral homeland in the Middle East, in Israel, and that they are someday going to end up all returning there at some point. Okay, to await the proverbial end, as it were. And so this is kind of the beginning of a more widespread 20th century version of that movement anyway. Beginning in 1939, we see the construction of the ghettos. And the term ghetto has turned into something completely different now in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. But what a ghetto originally was a small area of a city where a group of people were isolated. Okay, and in some cases it does still take on a similar meaning. But in this case, it has to do with people who are strategically targeted by the government itself and told that you are being denied citizenship rights, you're being denied all civil rights, and you're essentially being imprisoned in the walls of the specific area of a city. Okay, and ghettos were typically monitored, patrolled by the German police, in some cases by the Gestapo or by the German military. And people were typically forbidden from entering or leaving these areas. Okay, you were essentially under a form of house arrest, if you like. Okay? And in some cases, walls were constructed, gates were constructed, barbed wire fences, right, guard towers, ways of keeping people inside these closed off areas of the city. And it's only a means to an end. Okay, ghettos are not designed to exist forever. Okay, and we'll see what the aftermath of some of that is eventually. Ghettos also have a history of having uprisings that occur within them, right? Not all Jews are willing to just, do exactly what the government tells them to do. There are several uprisings in Munich, for example. There's a couple in other German cities. But there's typically one particular Jewish elder who is designated by the German government to be kind of the head of this particular ghetto. Okay, and the question of who is culpable and who is responsible for Holocaust-related atrocities in the midst of all this, the line gets a little bit fuzzy. Okay, so you have instances where the government will actually pick someone who is a respected leader of the community and will intimidate them and force them into essentially becoming a spy and an agent for the German government. Okay, in the meantime, viewing them as expendable. Okay, so you might have an elderly Jewish person who everybody looks up to in the community, but that person will also end up at some point doing something that ends up potentially betraying other individuals, and then everyone turns against them. Okay, so it's like a mafia mindset, right? Dirtying someone up in order to make sure that they take the blame instead of the people who are really responsible. Okay, so it's a really monstrous thing that ends up occurring. By the time we get to 1940, though, this is when things really turn the corner for the worse. Okay, you have in the figure of Heinrich Himmler here. Heinrich Himmler is the leader of what is called the Nazi SS, okay, or the Schutzstaffel. Okay, Schutzstaffel means protection squadron. Okay, this is someone who is basically Hitler's private secret police, is what it amounts to. It's another level above the Gestapo. And Himmler is a very notable sadist. He loves to watch people suffer. He loves to watch them be tortured. It's a favorite activity of his. And he is probably, aside from Hitler himself, probably the worst individual, arguably speaking, of all of the German officers in question. Okay? And he is put in charge of the quote-unquote Jewish question. What is to be done with Jews in Europe? Are we going to continue putting them in ghettos? Is this something sustainable? What is going to be done in the long term? By spring of 1941, this group called the Einsatzgruppen, right, the task forces is what they're known as, are established within the SS to begin to pull aside Jews out of the ghettos and to begin to execute them en masse. Okay? And initially, these task forces made up of Nazi stormtroopers, right? This is where Star Wars gets the term from. These Nazi stormtroopers round up Jews and they take them outside of towns and cities, and they cause the Jews to dig gigantic holes in the ground. They line them up, and then they machine gun everybody. Okay? And initially, this is something that the Germans realize is something that cannot be maintained for very long, okay, for a number of reasons. Unfortunately, to look at this as objectively as possible, as horrible as it is, the Germans realize this is something that, in terms of logistics, cannot be continued, okay, because of the number of bullets that are being used, the number of soldiers that have to be used to carry out these mass executions, and the fact that this is actually beginning to wear on the consciences of some of the soldiers in question, right? The ones who are actually being called to carry these things out. Okay? So you actually have certain instances, and there are records that you can find on the Library of Congress, on the Holocaust Museum websites, that deal specifically with German officers who end up actually losing their minds over this because they are forced to murder children in many cases. One particular officer began to drink himself to death, and became very, very violent and had to be completely removed from the operation altogether because of seeing children being gunned down every day. So the Nazis look at this and they realize it, and Himmler in particular realizes that they have to remove the human element from this. They cannot really have much of a middleman in between because they are actually losing control of their own forces in the process. So you see just how much of a scar this is leaving on everyone involved, except for, of course, individuals like Himmler. By the fall of 1941, Germany starts actually taking Jews out of ghettos, liquidating the ghettos themselves, and moving all Jews within these cities into concentration camps, designated in specific parts of the country. And I'll show you a map here in a few minutes, but depending on where the concentration camps are located, which direction people are moving in the country, they will know whether they are going to an actual concentration camp, which is more of a labor-oriented camp, or if they are going to a death camp. And a death camp is pretty self-explanatory. In spring of 1942, after we get past these liquidations of the ghettos, Heinrich Himmler presents what he refers to as the final solution. Okay? And the final solution is the euphemistic title that is given to the mass execution of Jews in gas chambers. Okay? It is another euphemism for the Holocaust in general, but for mass execution in particular. Again, the ghettos are completely liquidated in all German cities. Okay, this is something that falls in line with what Hitler wants to do in creating what he calls the Lebensraum, right? This living space for German citizens. In some cases, there's at least one case study that I know of, and several others that exist, where Germany would actually come into towns that were dominated by a Jewish population, and they would actually demolish the entire town and deport all the Jews out of the town, then rebuild the town and rename it and make it look like someplace in the Bavarian mountains, right? Make it look extremely German. They would begin bringing in German citizens to live there and would actually recreate the entire area. Okay, try to make it look like one of Hitler's propaganda posters. So very terrifying what they end up doing here. And of course, as I said before, now Jews are being sent to these concentration camps, and Zyklon B, the gas that's used in the gas chambers, is pumped into these areas, and people begin to be executed en masse. Okay, it's quicker, it's cheaper, it's easier. There's no human element involved, right? There's to refer to this as systematic is accurate, but still understated. And in the grand scheme of things, it's estimated that roughly 6 million Jews are killed in the Holocaust, including about 1 million people of other groups, okay, including people who suffer from mental and developmental disabilities. Okay, these are the people who are actually targeted first. Okay, so individuals who are physically disabled, mentally disabled, who are confined to mental hospitals in places in Germany, they are the ones who are taken out and executed or euthanized first. okay, because Hitler believes them to be degraded members of society. Okay? So they are actually taken out first, even German citizens. Homosexuals are targeted as well. Okay, even in the United States at this point, being a homosexual is still considered a crime. Okay, but in Germany in particular, under Hitler, it's punishable by death. Okay, and even in some parts of the world, unfortunately, it is today. The Romani people, right, the gypsies themselves are targeted as well. There are entire areas in the Baltic states where the Romani people are executed and wiped out, massacred in many cases, and even into places like Ukraine. Okay, and it's worth noting too that while it doesn't directly involve Nazi Germany, Russia is actually in the midst of its own Holocaust at this point at the same time. Joseph Stalin, it's estimated by the end of his reign, he is responsible for the deaths of approximately 12 million people during the time that the Holocaust is actually occurring. Okay, and these are people who are, ethnic Ukrainians, people who are from the Baltic states who are being suppressed by the Soviet Union. So overall, a combined total here, you're looking at something upwards of 20 million people overall who are being killed as innocent victims in the midst of all this. Okay? But the Holocaust, of course, is what we are talking about here, 6 million Jews. By the time the war does end, the Allied forces end up liberating over 100 concentration camps. Okay, and this begins sometime in late 1944, I think, and goes all the way into 46, I think, even in some cases. So there are still a few holdouts that exist. And there are 6 death camps in the entire area of Nazi-controlled Europe. Okay, Auschwitz-Birkenau is the one that is the most famous, and Auschwitz-Birkenau is unique in that it is both a concentration camp and a death camp. Okay, the entrance to Auschwitz, if you ever look at a photograph, is a rail line. Okay, it's basically, it has a train station attached to it where the rail will enter in, and depending on, once you are taken off the train car, if you are a Jew who has been deported to Auschwitz, depending on which door you are sent to once you get off. If you are taken to one side, you go into the concentration camp side. Okay, this is if you are able to work, if you are physically fit, if you are relatively healthy, they might put you to work building something or demolishing something. Okay. If you are deemed inferior, or if you are deemed not worthy to keep alive, if there's no reason for them to do that, they will send you to the other door, which is the death camp side, and you may be executed within the next few minutes. Okay, so it's positively monstrous. There's no other better way I can put it here. The others, Belzec, Kielno, Majdanek, Sobibor, and Treblinka, all the death camps, it's worth noting, are located in Poland. Okay, so if you are a German Jew living in Germany and you are sent to the east, to Poland, chances are you're being sent to a death camp of some kind. If you are being sent north, south, or west, somewhere in Germany, you're probably going to a concentration camp where you will work, you will live in horrible conditions, you could potentially die of disease or injury or malnourishment, but you stand a chance at surviving. Okay, so there are, and then this is entirely out of your control if you were a Jew who was a victim during this time. Okay, it all depends on the whims of those who are in control. It's estimated that at Auschwitz-Birkenau, roughly 865,000 people are killed as soon as they arrive. Okay, so again, if you get off the train and you are sent directly to the death camp side, quite often you are forced basically to strip down to nothing. You are put into a gas chamber with several other frightened people, and you are killed immediately. So it's again, there's no easy way to say it. It's a horrible thing. It's estimated that in one particular instance, 6,000 people are gassed in a single day. Okay, so you can, it's difficult to imagine this type of slaughter that's occurring here. The effects of the gas itself are too horrible to recount. I won't get into the the whatever it is, the it's hard to say, the pornography of dictatorship, right? You can research that for yourself if you wish. It is a nerve gas, and on a sidebar, Zyklon B was actually created by the Bayer company, the company that makes aspirin. today in the United States. It was a German-owned company. Again, this is an attempt to remove the human element, and it's impossible to do that. If you look at any Holocaust museum anywhere, if you go to Dallas, if you go to Washington D.C., there are collections of clothing, right, that people left behind. There was an entire pile of wedding rings that has been discovered. There is still a pile of shoes that exists at Auschwitz itself that still stands in the memorial. So that's, there's a remnant of people who are there, and it's impossible to overlook it. One of the only things that the United States manages to do to combat this, because a lot of it is kept secret for quite a while, the German government does attempt to do this. It's difficult for it to do it first, because many people, especially once the government begins executing people with firing squads, quite often the citizens who live in the towns who are German citizens can hear it happening. They can hear the gunfire in the distance. They can hear the screams. And they know in many instances when a train comes by that there are Jews on board. Okay, so it's, again, there's a question still of whether or not certain German citizens are considered culpable because they let it happen, because they didn't go against the government. But the alternative, of course, is they themselves would be killed. Okay, so it's a situation that's sounds like it would be an easy choice for us to make in the 21st century, but it's difficult to say. But again, back to the matter at hand, Roosevelt does manage to set up what he calls the War Refugee Board, and he manages to rescue about 200,000 European Jews in the process. There are several who come to Ellis Island who are, granted, citizenship to the United States, who are protected in some cases, and about 20,000 other persecuted individuals as well, right? So Romani, in some cases, people who are ethnic Germans who perhaps are homosexuals who have to pose as something else so they aren't arrested here in the country. There's all kinds of elements that are overlooked and which we may never know, okay, quite frankly, because of all the laws that were in place concerning it. So anyway, in a nutshell, as I said before, the Holocaust is such a massive topic that it's almost impossible to whittle it all down to a few minutes. This is a map of occupied Europe, and you can see here in all these little stars that exist all here, these are all areas where ghettos are established. Okay, and all of the little white stars here are ghettos that are established between 1941 and 43. The ones in gold are established between 39 and 41. Okay, most of these are located within Poland. And the ghettos established in 1944 are all the black ones down here in the south, in Slovakia and Hungary, places where the German army didn't arrive until much later. Okay. And to give you an idea of where all concentration camps and death camps are located. Okay. Each one of the black squares, the solid black ones, is a concentration camp. And you can see just exactly how scattered they are. Okay, they go all the way from over here in southern France near Gurs, all the way up here to the north in Valvera, right, in the border states between the Soviet Union. There's a few up in Sweden and Norway. There's some all the way down here on the Dalmatian coast, going all the way down into an area near Greece. Okay, so they are scattered virtually everywhere. Okay. And of course, as I said before, the death camps are all located in a pretty concentrated area. There are 6 of them that you see here. Okay, Chełmno, Treblinka, Majdanek, Sobibor, Belzec, and of course Auschwitz-Birkenau. Okay, they're all located in a concentrated area in Poland. Okay, so again, if you are a Jew living in Poland, or if you are deported to Poland, you are probably going to suffer a much worse fate than many of the other individuals who are involved. Okay. And in Poland in particular, Poland was probably the hardest place to live. It was the hardest hit place in the midst of the Holocaust. There is actually a very moving book that was written several years ago called Neighbors, in which it's a case study of a small town in Poland where Germans and ethnic Jews had lived side by side for generations with virtually no problems. And once the Nazis paid a visit to the town one day, within a day or two after that, all of the ethnic Germans in the town rounded the Jews up into a barn and set it on fire and burned it to the ground, killed everybody there, and then went on with the rest of their lives the next day as if nothing had happened. Okay, so there are multiple instances of this spreading, and to call it evil is really the only superlative that I can use. Okay, whether you believe in a higher power or not, evil exists in one form or another, and this is quite frankly the most evil thing that we have seen in the 20th century. Okay, so it's difficult to put any other word to it. Now, to continue on with the rest of the war here, moving into 1942, we move into the area of North Africa. Okay. For one thing, Joseph Stalin calls for an Allied intervention on a Western front, and most of mainland Europe at this point is still under the control of Germany. Okay, and Stalin is working on the side of the Allies at this point, even though he is committing several horrible atrocities within his own auspices, okay, against Ukrainians, against people, against the Russian people themselves. He is still technically working on the U.S. side because it's a situation of my enemy is my friend. Britain plans to look at German targets and continued aerial bombing in mainland Germany, and they finally begin to enlist American help when it comes to invading North Africa, Italy, and France. Okay, if they can get ships into the Mediterranean and begin to invade Europe from the south, perhaps they can actually sandwich the Germans in between the Americans and the British. In November of 1942, when we have the beginning of what is called Operation Torch. Okay, and Operation Torch is the North African campaign. Okay, it's when we have British and American forces working side by side on the ground, and they land in Morocco over here in North Africa on the Atlantic side, and in Algeria up here near Algiers in the Mediterranean. Okay. And again, it's still worth noting that Spain, which juts out up here at the top of this little map, is still controlled by Generalissimo Francisco Franco, who is himself a fascist and is working side by side with Mussolini in Italy, who you see over here on the right-hand side of the map, and of course with Nazi Germany. Okay, so everybody in the northern Mediterranean is working on the Axis side, and the Axis powers are beginning to bleed over into North Africa. At this point, Dwight Eisenhower is put in command of U.S. forces, and this is kind of where Eisenhower begins to gain a much larger reputation as a war hero. Okay, he is the one who ends up leading American forces through the D-Day campaign, through Operation Overlord, and afterward becomes a president of the United States. The Germans have under their command General Erwin Rommel. Okay, and Rommel is actually, his contingency is called the Africa Corps. Rommel is a unique individual and someone who has studied quite a bit by military programs, military universities in particular, because he was a very strategic man in terms of the way that his tank corps operated and so forth, and also because Rommel, at least ostensibly anyway, was not a proponent for the Holocaust. He was allegedly just considered himself a member of the German army, and in some cases used what could be known as the Nuremberg defense. Okay, the Nuremberg defense is something that was used by Nazis after the fact, although Rommel himself didn't actually survive the war. The Nuremberg defense is basically, I was just following orders. Okay, so you hear this used from time to time all throughout the 20th century. Anytime atrocities against humanity are committed, if a soldier is caught, they typically will say, I was only following orders. So it's called the Nuremberg defense. British forces in the midst of Operation Torch end up pushing the Germans and the Italians across Libya in the east. Okay, so you see these yellow arrows over here. Okay, British forces come down through here, and they end up pushing the Germans through these little red arrows at the bottom, pushing them into Tripoli and into Tunisia. And then you see the Axis line of defense moving steadily away from Libya into Tunisia, and eventually to the point to where they end up having to leave North Africa over time. And part of it is to do with the presence of General George Patton. Okay, and if you've ever seen the film Patton, You know that Patton was a very no-nonsense kind of guy. He was very eager to have his soldiers do exactly what he wanted, and was a little bit of a prima donna in the midst of all this. Okay? But effective in terms of strategy, to be sure. Okay? And his tank corps was actually largely responsible for chasing the Germans out of North Africa. By May 12th, Germany and Italy both surrender North Africa to Allied forces. Okay, so Operation Torch is actually a success for the Allies. And in January of 1943, Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and all of the other Anglo-American military chiefs, right, anybody who is, higher up general, colonels, and so forth, all get together and meet near Casablanca here in French Morocco, kind of on the left-hand side of the map here. And they agree that America is going to lead an assault on the island of Sicily here in the Mediterranean, just south of Italy, before ending up attacking the Italian mainland. Okay, so they're going to target Mussolini's fascist Italy first because he's been in power the longest and because he is technically the weakest link in the group. Roosevelt and Churchill agreed that they are going to intensify bombings against Germany. In the meanwhile, they're going to send the RAF and the U.S. Army Air Force against them. And they're going to continue to increase shipments to the USSR and to nationalist China to actually try to combat German aggression there and Japanese aggression in China. And they're determined that in the long run, they want the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. Okay? They don't want, they're not going to grant any kind of quarter here. They're not going to grant any kind of concession to make sure that these governments and these systems are going to be allowed to continue. Now, to back up a couple of years, we're still in the process of Germany continuing what it did in World War I. Okay, we have British merchant vessels that are under attack by German U-boats in exactly the same format that we saw in the First World War. Okay? This time, the main difference is that these U-boats are not operating alone. Okay, in the First World War, you had individual U-boats that were operating independently of one another, and were actually sinking merchant vessels, transport vessels under cover of darkness without the aid of sonar or anything like that to combat them. Now German U-boats are beginning to work together in a concentrated effort in something called wolf packs. Okay, and wolf packs are a squadron of perhaps 5 or more of these German U-boats who are working together and who might actually attack several ships at once in a particular area and then disappear down into the depths again. Okay, so it's an ambush of sorts. And again, the Allies are constantly bleeding supplies just like before. Okay, and it seems like this is another situation where we have to kind of ride it out and make sure that it's going to work this time. Okay? By July, the Allies lose 230 ships and about 5 million tons of war supplies. So food, ammunition, military uniforms, medicine, you name it, right? It's all sunk to the bottom of the Atlantic. And thankfully, the Allies managed to actually discover U-boat weaknesses over time. Okay, for one thing, the British managed to crack all the German naval codes. Okay, so they are able to actually intercept these wolf packs ahead of time. They know where their movements are going to be, where they're going to be located, and they're able to actually act with premonition here. They're actually able to destroy them ahead of time. And we also have much more widespread use of warplanes and anti-submarine weapons. Okay, we have the use of torpedoes now that have guided systems in place where you can actually launch them more effectively. Right before in the First World War, we only had underwater mines to be used here. And of course, warplanes can work in reconnaissance. Sometimes they can spot these things from the air. Sometimes they even have sonar, which is actually developed over time. And sonar and radar are used in much more of a prominent way as soon as we get nearer the end of the war. Okay, so we can actually track the movements of submarines, we can target them more easily, and we can destroy them. And we also end up using much tighter convoys. Okay, so you might have a merchant vessel that is actually being escorted by at least 2 or 3 other ships that are providing protection for it. Okay, so in addition to that, you might have an aircraft carrier that is launching planes into the air to work in aerial reconnaissance as well. So several other protective measures are being used here that quite frankly just didn't exist in the First World War. In July of 1943, the Americans and the British end up invading Sicily, and they take it over rather quickly. Okay? On July 25th, the Italian king, who is still in power, by the way, he is still only a figurehead here, right? He's been in support of Mussolini and his government for a long time, but he ends up actually turning around and dismissing Mussolini as the prime minister, and he actually has him arrested. Germany, meanwhile, catches wind of this and realizes that Italy is in a very vulnerable state. Okay, so Hitler sends German forces into Italy, invades it, and ends up causing a stalemate for the Allies because the Germans actually end up taking over Italy. They end up releasing Mussolini over time, and they actually install him as a puppet dictator in the north part of Italy. On August 17th, Sicily is actually effectively under Allied control. So the Allies are actually knocking on the door of the Axis powers at this point. So in February of 1944, this is when Mussolini is liberated. He is put in a fascist puppet state in northern Italy and is given a limited amount of power. Okay, this is kind of where he lasts out for the rest of the war. And on June 4th, the U.S. Fifth Army enters Rome and actually takes Rome for itself, takes back Italy, and is now occupying a small portion of the upper Mediterranean. Now, in fall of 1933, we get another meeting of what are called the Big Three here. It's Winston Churchill for Great Britain, Franklin Roosevelt for the United States, and Joseph Stalin for the USSR. Okay. The three of these guys meet together in Tehran, which is the capital of Iran. And Iran, at this point, just as a quick side note, has come under fire after the First World War, right? Right around 1935, the British actually tried to take control of, I think it's, 35 is when Iran actually ends up nationalizing its oil industry. And so by the time we get into this period and a little bit after, the British and the Allies actually begin to take more and more advantage of oil supplies in the Middle East. Okay, so this is right around the time that we start to move our focus a little bit more into the Middle East in the 20th century. This meeting is actually a planned invasion of Nazi-controlled France. Okay, and at the same time that the British and the Americans agree to undertake this, the Russians agree to launch a large counteroffensive in Eastern Europe. Okay, and so what we're planning on doing now is sandwiching the German army in between the East and the West. Okay, so they have no other place to go. And they all agree that they are going to form the United Nations after the end of the war. Okay, so the United States actually is going to join this as well. In the midst of all this, though, Roosevelt is still kind of hesitant about doing any business with Joseph Stalin. Okay, the American people, in some cases, especially the conservative part of America, has targeted FDR quite a bit up until now for being a supporter of socialist tendencies under his administration. Some have even accused him outright of being a communist, but he himself actually very much distrusts communism. Okay, he already knows what's going on. He has a general understanding of what Stalin is actually doing to his own people, and so he knows that this is not something that can be trusted in the long term. In the aftermath, the U.S. Army Air Force bombs Germany relentlessly for the next several weeks and months, destroying factories, destroying airfields, to kind of clear the way and make sure that an invasion force, once it does land, is not going to run into much opposition. Unfortunately, American forces end up killing about 350,000 civilians in these aerial bombings. Okay, so there is no way of targeting military installations apparently as effectively as the Allies would like. Okay, so this is something that goes relatively unnoticed, or at least unspoken in a lot of cases. But the Allies do manage to wear down the Luftwaffe over time. The Luftwaffe is not really able to get many planes in the air to combat the bombers. A lot of the planes end up getting destroyed, so it does end up crippling Germany quite a bit. And in 1944, Dwight Eisenhower is named the Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. Okay, so he is going to be put in charge of soldiers on the ground in mainland Europe now. And Operation Overlord is the name that is given to the operation he is being put in charge of. This is supposed to be a planned amphibious invasion of northern France. Okay, and it's estimated by most scholars and most strategians and everything like that at the time that this is only going to have about a 50% chance of success. Okay? That there is not really any deciding factor that says that this is going to work. Okay, the U.S. forces have fought in northern France in the First World War. They know what the weather is like. They know that it's constantly raining and stormy and cold, even in the midst of summer. Right? There's no guarantee that they're going to have a nice day. And the Allies do manage to use a little bit of deception here. They send troops about 200 miles north of where they do actually plan on landing. They try to, deter the Germans away from the area so that they can land troops more effectively. And to a certain extent, it does work. Despite all the horrible numbers that do actually end up happening when the landing occurs, they could have been much, much worse. On June 5th, the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne divisions end up parachuting down over Normandy under cover of darkness, and 3 German divisions are actually defeated in the aftermath. Okay, these paratroopers are actually targeted by flak guns in the middle of the night, so the Germans are actually shooting up at American planes, killing a lot of paratroopers as they are floating down in the sky defenseless. Okay. But once the Allies who do survive it do get on the ground, they end up destroying several bridges. They destroy a lot of artillery positions. They capture a lot of guns. And so they basically disable a lot of the German defensive procedures. And of course, the invasion of Normandy is possibly the most famous instance involving the United States in the war. Okay. June 6th of 1944 is what is now known as D-Day. Okay, this is the day that the U.S. and the British forces land together at Normandy, and the picture you see in the background here is just one of many that exists. It's estimated that 5,300 Allied ships containing 370,000 soldiers and sailors make landfall in northern Germany, here in Normandy. And of course, they're plagued by a lot of problems, as we've already said. The weather is horrible. It's raining. It's cold. The wind is blowing. The seas are rough. In many cases, a lot of the landing craft don't even make it to shore. Right? In some cases, they're caught in riptides. They're toppled over. The soldiers end up drowning in many cases. Of course, the Germans are constantly shooting at them as they are landing. So some soldiers, even when they do manage to get to the beach itself, sometimes they even fall out of the landing craft and they drown in 2 or 3 feet of water because they've been shot and they can't get up. It's estimated that over 1,000 men drown in this particular instance, right? In this way, right? Just trying to get out of the landing craft. And many boats get caught in the surf and are sent into the wrong area. They end up landing in the wrong location, several miles up or down the beach. The Germans, though, are caught by surprise because they believe that they've suppressed the American invasion in another area. But the Germans do still have quite a bit of defenses that the Allies have to overcome here. There are concrete machine gun nests that are established all up and down the beachhead. There's barbed wire that's littering the area. These little concrete conical structures on the ground called dragon's teeth. This is to basically prevent any kind of landing craft from getting up the beach any further. And these things called Czech hedgehogs. You see these, this little image up here at the top right. A Czech hedgehog is basically 3 big bars of steel that's all been welded together, and is supposed to create some kind of a barrier for any kind of landing craft to get up the beach. And most of the time, the soldiers have to hide behind this to try to prevent getting shot as they're getting up the beach. The first units that land at Omaha Beach end up losing 90% of their men. Okay, so again, just like instances like we saw in the First World War at the Somme and other cases, we have dramatic numbers of men who are killed in a very short amount of time. One particular company of 205 men loses 197 of them in 10 minutes. Okay, just because they are running up the beach, up the hill, toward machine gun nests that are firing down at them in a driving rainstorm. There can't be any worse conditions really to fight in. By nightfall, though, it's estimated 170,000 Allied troops do successfully land in Normandy. And of those, over 10,000 are either dead or wounded. Okay, so this is a horrible single day that this occurs. And over the course of the next 3 weeks, about 1 million Allied troops end up landing with about 566,000 tons of supplies and about 171,000 vehicles, right? Tanks, jeeps, armored cars, you name it. And it's considered the largest seaborne invasion in history up until that point, okay? It dwarfs anything else that's been attempted in the past. And by July 25th, Allied forces managed to gain control of Normandy, okay? So less than 2 months later. Now, in August of 1944, the American and French contingency end up landing on the Mediterranean coast, and they push up the Rhone Valley. Okay, so they're moving up now from the south as well. About 10 weeks of fighting later, the Germans end up losing control of France, and they end up retreating back into Germany. Okay, so France is actually liberated finally. In August 25th, the Free French Resistance, which has been working underground, kind of in the midst of Nazi occupation, they end up coming to the aid of the Allies, and they end up liberating Paris in the process. And by mid-September, most of France and Belgium has been cleared of German troops. Okay, there's a few holdouts here and there that are hiding out in the countryside, but they are hunted down and removed very quickly. The Soviets, meanwhile, are moving from the east to the west. Okay, so we now have this active sandwiching campaign that's going on. And from D-Day to the end of the war, it's estimated that 1.2 million Germans are either killed or wounded in the process. Okay, so this is a dramatic number of people who are wiped out by this. And Franklin Roosevelt actually begins a fourth term as president in the midst of all this. Okay, again, completely surpassing the three terms that he's already enjoyed. He now begins a fourth term. And he defeats Thomas Dewey once again. And again, you see Thomas Dewey up here. February 4th through 11th in 1945, the year that the war actually does come to an end, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, which you see here in the background, the three of them, meet together for the Yalta Conference in Crimea on the Black Sea. And they come to the agreement that Soviets are going to end up occupying East Germany, and Americans, British, and the French are going to occupy West Germany. Okay, so they're going to divide Germany down the middle and occupy it as a joint force. And Berlin, in particular, is going to be a zone of joint occupation. They're going to divide it into 4 quarters: a Soviet quarter, a British one, an American one, and a French one. Stalin, meanwhile, is given control of the expansive territories in Eastern Europe and Eastern Asia. Okay, and this is a mistake that the United States ends up acknowledging after the fact. It's a little too late, unfortunately, and paves the way for what ends up occurring, which we'll talk about in chapter 27, which is the Cold War, the beginning of the Cold War. And he's given these territories primarily because he agrees to lend Russian assistance in defeating Japan, okay, and to have support for the United Nations. The Yalta Declaration is signed by these guys, the big three, and they guarantee that they are going to have free and open elections in Eastern Europe. Stalin almost immediately reneges on this promise. Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and East Germany are all plundered by the Soviets immediately thereafter. Okay, and these areas all fall under the auspices of communism all the way up until roughly 1990. Okay, so this is a long siege, basically, that ends up occurring in the aftermath of this. And the first organizational meetings for the UN are supposed to be held on April 25th. Unfortunately, on April 12th, Franklin Roosevelt actually collapses into a coma while he's actually posing for a portrait. Okay, and this picture you see here to the right is actually the last visage of him in life. Okay, he was actually sitting posing for this in his home when he collapsed. So this is what his face looked like at the moment of his death. Okay, 2 hours later, he dies of a massive cerebral hemorrhage. Okay, so the stress that is put upon him by the war itself, by everything that's occurring, and of course for the fact that he has gone through 3 full presidential terms in office and has just begun a 4th. You see what it does to an individual. Okay, and of course, all throughout American history, any president who serves more than one term in office, you see just how much it ends up wearing on them. Their hair turns extremely gray. They end up with dark circles under their eyes, just like you see here with Franklin Roosevelt. And in some cases, it can end up harming their health to the point of killing them. Okay, we saw Woodrow Wilson have a stroke immediately after the First World War. Okay. So unfortunately, under the auspices of Franklin Roosevelt, America does not enter the UN just yet. By 1945, Hitler realizes that he is fighting a losing war. There is no real concentrated effort by this point for Germany to expand any of its territory. Hitler has thrown all of his resources into one part of his military or another. He's changed his strategies multiple times. He's even begun to pit his own armed forces against themselves. He actually tries to sow enough competition between what are called the Kriegsmarine, or the German Navy, and the German Army, that the two of them actually begin competing for favor with him. And ultimately, he ends up abandoning the Kriegsmarine in favor of the Army. Okay. And when that happens, and when he begins Operation Barbarossa, he loses quite a bit of support, even from his own group. Okay, so he's constantly making erratic decisions here, and no one is really able to follow him. On April 28th of 1945, Hitler marries his mistress, a young lady named Eva Braun, who you see here. The Wolf's Lair is the name of his underground bunker that exists somewhere nearby in Berlin. And in the same time that this happens, Mussolini and his mistress are captured, shot, and publicly hung by their heels in Milan. Okay, and Mussolini's corpse is actually left on display for, I believe, several days thereafter, and people actually line up in many cases to spit on his corpse. This is a pretty horrific thing that actually ends up happening. 2 days after Hitler and his mistress end up marrying, Braun ends up poisoning herself with cyanide, and Hitler puts a revolver to his head and shoots himself. The aftermath of their death is something that has turned into several conspiracy theories because their bodies are never recovered. The officers and the employees of Hitler and his secretary and so forth, they all end up taking the bodies out and burning them. They douse them with gasoline and burn them outside the bunker. The film Downfall is one of the finest representations of Hitler's final days that you can find. It's actually very well put together. The man who plays Hitler is extremely convincing, but it shows kind of how his mind ends up unraveling in the last few days that he's there, and all the deaths and the suicides that end up ensuing, not just his. For one thing, the Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, who you see here, he and his wife Magda Goebbels end up poisoning their children and themselves with cyanide in the midst of all this. Their 2 young children are given cyanide capsules and put to bed. A few days later, on May 2nd, Berlin ends up falling to the Allied forces. Russia actually arrives there first. And on May 7th, the German chief of staff surrenders unconditionally to the Allies. Next day is considered VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, and this is where we get the what is now called the peace sign, the 2 fingers that are held up. Initially, it was Winston Churchill that came up with this idea. It was supposed to be V for victory. Now, another area that we haven't talked about yet is something that is still that we have to backtrack a little bit on, is the Pacific theater of the war. This is another area of the war that is an entire branch of something that was going on at the same time that the war in Europe was going on. Okay, the war in Europe, it's estimated in terms of America's involvement. The European War was very much a European war. Okay, the war in the Pacific, though, was very much an American war. Okay, because roughly 25% of America's forces in World War II were sent to Europe, and 75% of them fought in the Pacific. Okay, so if you were a member of the U.S. Armed Forces, you had about 3/4 of a chance that you were going to be fighting the Japanese. Now, the Japanese have begun to expand very dramatically into the Pacific, even before the war ends up beginning. Okay, we already saw that they were taking over large portions of mainland China, that they were threatening to expand into the Philippines and to start capturing other islands that are occupied by U.S. forces. And the map of the Pacific is extremely, complicated, as you can see here. There's several thousands of islands that exist down here in the south. But in the first few weeks and months of the Japanese campaign in the Pacific, they end up capturing Hong Kong, Burma, Malaya, Singapore, and French Indochina, which is modern-day Vietnam. Right, this entire area, all of the yellow areas here, are all controlled by the Japanese within the first few months of the war, including, as you can see, the Philippines. And the U.S. forces, again, have had control of the Philippines since the Spanish-American War in 1898. Okay, so this is when the U.S. finally loses control of that. In April of 1942, the Japanese do capture about 12,000 Americans and 66,000 Filipinos, and they march them 65 miles in the course of 6 days across what is called the Bataan Peninsula down here in the Philippines. And this is called the Bataan Death March. Okay? And there are very few soldiers who are still alive today who are survivors of this, but they refer to themselves affectionately as the Battling Bastards of Bataan. It's estimated 10,000 soldiers, both Filipinos and Americans, end up dying along the way. Okay, most of them are marched barefoot. Many of them end up contracting malaria or dysentery and dying very horribly along the way. So again, a lot of the same types of illnesses that we saw in the Spanish-American War end up making a comeback here. From May 2 to May 6 of 1942, the U.S. forces managed to sink an aircraft carrier, and they downed 70 planes in what is called the Battle of the Coral Sea. Okay, and if you look at the map over here, at the very bottom of it, you see the northern coast of Australia. On the right-hand side of that is the Coral Sea Battle. Okay, and Battle of the Coral Sea is what essentially stops the Japanese aggression in the Pacific. Okay, if the Japanese had won the Battle of the Coral Sea, their next stop would have been to invade Australia. Okay, and that was their plan, was to invade Darwin in northern Australia and to take control of that continent as well. By June 4th, the Japanese end up attacking Midway and are actually surprised by U.S. forces here. Okay, U.S. forces actually end up running into them, and the Battle of Midway is what ends up putting them on the defensive, right? It ends up halting their aggression and causes them to turn around and run the other way. And the thing that makes this battle so important is that this is where the Americans end up cracking the Japanese naval codes. Okay, we actually have a naval war room that actually exists, a code room that exists within the U.S. Navy. And Admiral Chester Nimitz, who you see here, for whom several ships and submarines have been named since, was in charge. And the Battle of Midway is really the first major defeat of the Japanese Navy in about 350 years. Okay, this is something where the Japanese have had so much strategy, they've had so much sponsorship for the last several decades that it seems like they would be undefeatable. But because we've managed to crack their strategy and use all the technology at our fingertips, we managed to actually push them back. Okay, so this is the first time the Japanese Navy is put on the defensive for the first time. And it's worth noting, too, that this is, this is still about 6 or 7 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Okay, so the U.S. forces have been constantly dogging the Japanese in the Pacific, trying to chase them, trying to attack them, trying to basically get revenge for what happened at Pearl Harbor. And now they finally are managing to execute that. In 1942, General Douglas MacArthur is put in command of the Southwest Pacific Forces. Okay. And MacArthur is actually a rather unsavory figure in some people's eyes, depending on who you ask. For some people, MacArthur is considered to be a hero because of the general image that he presents to the American people. But unfortunately, he is actually considered to be a very big prima donna. Right? Most of the film footage that you see of him and the photographs are all staged. and a lot of film footage of him jumping out of a boat onto the land, and marching up the land. He would have them film multiple takes of it to make himself look good. And his typical strategy in this war and in Korea actually is to basically try to pick a fight with as many people as he can, whether he can win it or not. Okay? And it's evidenced with the battle on Guadalcanal. Okay, Guadalcanal is over here down near the bottom of this map, right by the Coral Sea here if you look to the right and just a little bit up. In August of 1942, MacArthur lands 16,000 U.S. Marines on the island of Guadalcanal to try to take over a Japanese airbase. Unfortunately, what he doesn't realize is that there is the Japanese Navy is stationed nearby, and they end up attacking the landing craft, and MacArthur actually ends up abandoning 16,000 U.S. Marines on Guadalcanal, and they are left there by themselves when the U.S. Navy ends up leaving. Okay, and MacArthur promises them he will return for them, but he doesn't come back until February of 1943. So they are there on their own on this island with the Japanese, hiding out in the jungle for several months under fire by the Japanese. So it's a miraculous thing these soldiers actually end up surviving. Once this actually does come to a close and the Japanese are defeated in 1943, the U.S. forces end up employing what's called an island hopping strategy. And it's exactly what it sounds like. They end up moving, as you can see with these little arrows on the map, from one island to the next to try to secure them from the Japanese forces and to make sure that they can maintain them and then move to the next one. In June of 1944, the islands of Tinian, Guam, and Saipan are all liberated by U.S. forces. It takes 3 weeks of conflict to get some of them, but they do manage to do it. And there's estimated to be about 20,000 Japanese casualties, 7,000 of which are ordered suicides. Okay, the Japanese tradition of seppuku is used here. Seppuku is the ritual suicide instead of actually surrendering. Okay, so it's an honor code that is utilized. Some have argued that it originates with the samurai. October 23rd to the 26th of 1944 is the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and this is considered the largest naval battle in history. Okay, there are so many ships that are involved here, and it becomes the worst Japanese defeat of the war. This is what causes the Japanese to actually begin to retreat. Okay, and Leyte Gulf, if you look, I believe it's up here. Let me look here on the map. I believe it's up here near Saipan and Iwo Jima. It's somewhere in between the two of them. 216 U.S. ships and 64 Japanese ships are involved in this particular battle. And this is when the Japanese began using the kamikaze pilots. Okay? The word kamikaze simply means divine wind. And if you look up here on the right, the upper right-hand portion of the screen, this image of this plane here, you see that it's not really so much an aerodynamic plane, but it's also hydrodynamic. Because what happens here is this is a plane that is fitted with explosives in the tip. This is a piloted torpedo is what it amounts to. A pilot would be put into the cockpit here and would be literally welded in place. Okay, so even if they do manage to crash their plane, they will not get out of it alive. And the kamikaze pilots are specifically designed to not only be able to in some cases, they're not even fitted with guns, right? These ships are supposed to be able to launch into the air and then dive bomb ships and act as, again, a piloted torpedo, just absolutely cause devastation. And it's estimated about 4,000 kamikazes deaths end up occurring throughout the war. Okay, so this is not the only instance in which this is used. Battle of Iwo Jima is probably the most famous battle in the Pacific. Okay, and you see the iconic image in the background of the U.S. Marines raising the flag on Iwo Jima. This occurs from February 19th until March 26th of 1945. We're inching closer and closer to the Japanese mainland. And the Battle of Okinawa occurs from April to June of 1945 as well. Okinawa is particularly disturbing because there are accounts in which U.S. forces end up firing on the Japanese and getting confused in the midst of it, and they actually end up massacring large groups of civilians who they mistake for being soldiers running at them. In reality, they are civilians trying to get away from the Japanese. As we inch closer and closer to Japan, right now that we're on Okinawa, we're only a few dozen miles away from the Japanese mainland. U.S. forces began to plan what is called Operation Downfall. They initially planned to invade the Japanese mainland on foot and take over Tokyo. On March 9th, General Curtis LeMay orders the firebombing of Tokyo with U.S. planes, and they do end up weakening Japan quite a bit. 66 Japanese cities are bombed, several hundreds of buildings are destroyed, several thousands of people are killed. And of course, by the time we get to this point in history, this is when we are inching closer and closer to the use of the atomic bomb. In 1945, the Japanese showed that they have no intention of surrendering to U.S. forces. Okay? And by all accounts, the U.S. forces could potentially continue to fight the Japanese on their own mainland, and the simple ferocity of Japanese soldiers could indicate that they might be able to fight U.S. forces off. Okay? There are accounts that exist from even several decades after the end of World War II, in which Japanese soldiers who were stationed in the Philippines and in remote islands actually were huddled down inside of caves for several decades, not knowing that the war had ended, and were actually still considered that they were fighting on behalf of the Japanese Empire. Okay, they were all old men. Harry S. Truman now is president of the United States, now that Roosevelt has passed. And he learns of the successful detonation of the atomic bomb in White Sands, New Mexico. And Truman is very, very eager to utilize this. If you look at a map here of Japan, right, the Japanese mainland is this little island peninsula here. Two targets are chosen for the aerial bombing using the atomic bomb: Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Truman decides that this bomb is something that he can use as a tool for leverage. And on July 25th, he says that if Japan does not surrender by August 3rd, he will authorize use of the atomic bomb. And the predicted casualties from this bomb are dramatically lower than what they actually end up being. America does not realize exactly what it has in its arsenal by using this. Initial predictions are about 20,000 less than what actually end up, or 20,000 is what the initial estimates are. And what the actual numbers are, we'll see here in just a minute. In July, Truman actually ends up meeting with Stalin and Churchill at Potsdam. Potsdam is in Central Europe. And they come up with what's called the Potsdam Declaration. This is what ends up officially outlawing Nazism. Okay, and of course, even today in Germany, if you possess any kind of Nazi paraphernalia, if you wear anything with Nazi symbols on it, if you make any kind of gestures in public or anything, you will be arrested very swiftly. They have a no-tolerance policy for this. And the Potsdam Declaration also demands that the Japanese surrender by August 3rd. Okay, they know that the U.S. has the atomic bomb in their arsenal and that the U.S. is willing to use it. The deadline, of course, passes, and 3 days later, on August 6th at 8:15 in the morning, the airship, the Enola Gay, drops a 5-ton uranium bomb on Hiroshima. The bomb is nicknamed Little Boy, even though it's a smaller size bomb, but it's a much larger payload. Okay. In the initial blast, it kills 78,000 people. 23 of those people are U.S. POWs, people who were actually completely abandoned by the U.S. Armed Forces and by the government, and basically are chalked up as casualties of war. Okay, so 78,000 people are killed just by the initial blast itself. And you can see footage of atomic bomb tests and detonations and so forth on YouTube if you wish. It's horrific to watch. By the end of the year, 140,000 people die of radiation sickness. The radiation fallout from this is something that no one really anticipates happening. Okay, and of course there's all kinds of horrific footage and photographs that you can find of young children who suffer from radiation burns, people who are completely disfigured by the blast itself, who end up dying, and it's absolutely horrible. And when J. Robert Oppenheimer actually saw what occurred, when he saw the footage of it, when he saw the bomb being dropped and the devastation that it caused, he actually had almost a mental breakdown, is what it amounts to. He is said to have quoted from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, in which he says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." So he realizes that he is the one who has created this thing that has cost so many people's lives. And he deeply regretted what he did thereafter. Harry Truman, meanwhile, had no regrets at all about dropping the bomb, never expressed any regret for it at any point in his life. 2 days later, the Soviet Union decides it's going to declare war on Japan. Okay, now that the U.S. has come through with its first promise of dropping one bomb, the Soviet Union declares war. Following day after that, still no word of a Japanese surrender. The airship boxcar drops what's called Fat Man on Nagasaki. And Fat Man is the second bomb. It's a smaller payload and a much larger carapace, if you like. It's a larger shaped bomb. Nagasaki, 40,000 people are killed in the initial blast, and 80,000 are killed by year's end from radiation sickness. And there is actually at least one story that I know of a Japanese man who survived the bombing of Hiroshima and hid in a drainage pipe from the radiation and all that, got out, got dressed, cleaned himself off, and went to work in Nagasaki just in time for the second bomb to drop, and survived that one as well. Okay, so there's several instances where this type of thing occurred apparently, but horrifying, as you can imagine. I mean, the sheer devastation of what occurs is beyond catastrophic. Like, there's no way to overstate it. Japan finally, though, wears down by August 14th and surrenders unconditionally to U.S. Allied forces. On September 2nd, the formal surrender takes place in Tokyo Bay. General MacArthur actually ends up overseeing it on board one of the U.S. aircraft carriers, and so anyway, the Japanese emperor actually has to, as part of the terms of his surrender, has to tell the Japanese people that he is not in fact a god, that he is not divine. And varying accounts come out after this of what actually ends up happening. In some cases, there are reports that the Japanese people, in some cases, actually end up committing suicide because they can't cope with the fact that their emperor is not divine. Whether this is rumor or not, I don't really have any verification of it. But word of mouth is kind of what my understanding is from that. And it's also worth noting, too, that several members of the U.S. Armed Forces who were POWs in Japanese prison camps were actually present when the surrender was signed. One particular general who was in control of a lot of U.S. Army men in Japan was actually, or in the Pacific, was actually present there, and he was whittled down to virtually nothing. He was just a ghost of a man. If you ever see any of the photographs, he looks like he has been through the Holocaust. Right? He ends up, I think he lost somewhere in the neighborhood of probably 80 to 100 pounds, and was down to maybe 100 pounds when he actually witnessed the signing. And to call World War II a transformative war is, again, quite an understatement. Okay, it's the costliest war that has ever happened in U.S. history before or since. 50 million civilians were killed, and approximately 22 million combatants were killed. 292,000 combat deaths occurred, 114,000 non-combat deaths just among U.S. forces alone. 1 million more U.S. soldiers were wounded. And it's estimated that for every U.S. soldier killed, 59 Soviets were killed. Okay, so much so that I can't remember which year it is, but I believe it's any Soviet soldier who was born within a certain year. I think it was 85% of Soviet males born in one particular year in the early 1930s were wiped out by this war. An entire generation of young men were gone. And the Allied victory was not something that was ever really a guaranteed thing. Okay, more so to the opposite because of Hitler's initial strategies, because of all the tactics that he used, because of his arsenal, because of his propaganda. All of it went against what the Allies could have potentially done if they didn't have the means to do it. Okay? And so several factors are involved here. Roosevelt and Churchill working together, coordinating military and morale efforts, made all the difference that you can imagine. Okay? If the U.S. had not come to the aid of Great Britain and the two of them had not worked together, it would have been a very different end. Of course, Hitler became increasingly unstable in the course of the war. He became withdrawn from public life, was very paranoid, was worried that people were going to end up assassinating him. He actually did survive at least 2 assassination attempts that I know of in the course of all this. Survived a bombing in one of his bunkers, which was actually made into a couple of different films, one of which had Tom Cruise in it a few years ago, called Operation Valkyrie. And of course, Hitler became more and more just paranoid that people were going to poison him, that they were going to stab him in the back, and all that kind of thing. So his lack of trust in his own people and the discourse that he was sowing constantly ended up working against him. America's ability to mobilize its industry into a concentrated effort is another thing that works to its advantage. Okay, this is something that was not necessarily unprecedented, but to the grand scale that it ends up accomplishing by the end of the war is really dramatic. And the fact that the Soviets are able to absorb the German invasion and end up repelling it in the long term is another dramatic thing. In part because of the Soviet cruelty against their own soldiers, against their people, and just the brute force that they end up showing. Okay, for better or for worse, they did quite a lot of good. And of course, the Axis powers themselves eventually do run out of supplies in some cases. Okay, this is still another war of attrition, just like we saw with World War I. Japan essentially runs out of food. It's not able to feed its soldiers and its populace. And Germany runs out of fuel. Okay, all of the German war machines end up eating diesel fuel like you wouldn't imagine. Okay, so that's why the Navy ends up going under so quickly, because all the machinery is costing too much, and eventually, they can't mobilize things anymore. And the new international dynamic at the end of the Second World War completely outpaces what we saw at the end of the first one. Okay, America is now the dominant quote-unquote superpower. Okay, and just like we saw in the First World War, this is something that America comes out on top, but it's something that is actually sustainable this time. Okay, we have the most powerful military, and we have atomic weaponry. Okay, so the rest of the world knows that America is not above using this again. The authority of the president, of course, has increased dramatically throughout the war. Okay, Franklin Roosevelt has established new government boards. He has established new offices. He's taken new powers that no other president before him has done. And of course, as I said before, all the industry has created new jobs. It has expanded the economy, and it's ended the Great Depression. And now big businesses are able to give way to these massive corporations that exist in America. Okay, the government begins handing out government-sponsored contracts, grants to universities, to corporations, to actually begin using a lot of the technology that is developed by the military during the war in the public sector. And so all these new technologies that are sent into the public and the private sector include things like radar, computers, of course, electronics, plastic, jet engines, rockets, and atomic energy. Okay, everything that becomes fuel for the popular imagination during the Cold War all originates during World War II. And all these new social opportunities that have been given to minorities, to women in the United States, begin to create more and more traction for a civil rights movement to actually finally get underway. And beginning with the end of World War II, the U.S. Armed Forces finally do become desegregated. So we start to take steps in the right direction here, though there is still a very long road to go on that. Meanwhile, on the other side of the aisle, we have the Soviet Union. Okay, and the Soviet Union, with the Yalta Declaration, with the Potsdam Declaration, has been given immense amounts of territory that it ends up exploiting and using to the detriment of everyone else around it. Okay, it is now the greatest power that exists in either Europe or Asia combined. Through the course of the next few years, it ends up expanding its territory, it expands its international influence, and starts amassing more and more and more of its armed forces, including eventually gaining atomic weaponry. And of course, the other Allied powers and even the Axis powers that are involved are all devastated by this war, okay, just like we saw in the first one. France, Germany, Great Britain, and Japan are all either destroyed and or impoverished by the war. And because now we have these two gigantic quote-unquote superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, we now have an effectively polarized world. Okay, so some of these countries will look to the United States, which is considered the first world. Others will look to the Soviet Union, which is the second world. And those who do not choose to side with either one become members of the third world. Okay, and this is where we get the term from.